Hey, what's up everybody? It's Rutech, and today we'll be talking about the best $600 gaming PC for June of 2020. Now $600 will get you a rig that is easily capable of achieving competitive frame rates at both 1080p and 1440p, and you'll probably even be able to push 4K in some lower demanding titles. Nowadays, $600 gets you a true powerhouse of a PC. The rig in the build guide we'll be talking about today has a 6-core 12-thread processor, 16GB of RAM, a ton of storage, and a fairly new, very strong graphics card. So let's get into it talking about the parts, but before we do, I'd really appreciate it if you checked out my channel. I post PC tech videos among other things. Also, if you have any comments or questions as the video goes along, be sure to drop a comment. If you like the video, drop a like, and if you enjoy the content you're seeing, drop a sub. It really helps out the channel. Alright, so let's dive straight into it with the CPU. We are using the all-reliable AMD Ryzen 5 1600AF. So do not get this chip confused with the 1600, they are two completely different parts. The 1600AF is an updated Zen Plus faster version of the 1600. This means it has a 12nm architecture compared to the 14nm architecture in the original 1600. Anyway, with the 1600AF you won't get some crazy bottlenecking. With 6 cores and 12 threads, you're getting optimal performance for 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K gaming. It also has a base clock of 3.2 GHz, boost clock of 3.6 GHz, and is overclock ready. A great CPU for a 2020 gaming build. Next up, the motherboard. In this build, I suggest the GIGABYTE B450 Micro ATX motherboard. An overall great motherboard, it supports both first and second gen processors, overclocking, and is a real solid motherboard. I like GIGABYTE products, and their motherboards are no exception. In addition, this motherboard supports 3200 MHz memory, which is perfect for the RAM that we are using, which leads me to a RAM, which is G.Skill's Aegis 16GB, so 2/6 of 8GB RAM. It's DDR4 and has a speed of 3200 MHz. Now 3200 MHz is great for this build, as it is not only fast, but is also the maximum speed that is compatible with the motherboard we're using. So since it's 16GB, you won't really have to ever worry about upgrading within the next couple of years. Only now are games starting to recommend that you have over 16GB, so 16GB is a perfect amount. In addition, G.Skill is a great reputable company, so this also is some really reliable memory. Now the motherboard we are using has 4 RAM slots, so if you do want to upgrade, you absolutely can. Next on the guide, we have the storage. In this build, I decided to put 2 different storage devices, one for speed and one for capacity. Usually in this price range, you'll want to have both an SSD and a hard drive. So for the hard drive, I selected the Western Digital Caviar Blue 500GB 7200 RPM drive. Now 500GB is enough for a decently sizable game library. Well, at least with most games. I personally was fine with 500GB for about 2 years till I bought myself another one, but if you plan on having a ton of games, you might want to get a bigger drive. This is just what I suggest if we're staying within the $600 budget. You can totally get a different hard drive with more capacity if you'd like. For the SSD, we are using the ADATA SU635 240GB solid state drive. 240GB is a decent amount of space. You can throw a few games on this drive. My only main suggestion is to ensure that this is where you install Windows. It'll make your experience light years faster, especially with boot times. SSDs are significantly faster than disk drives, so if you want faster access to files or loading times for games, I suggest you put those files on this drive. Next up, the part you've probably been waiting to hear about, the video card. I selected the 1650 Super from NVIDIA. Now let me explain why. The other graphics cards that would have worked for the $600 budget were the 580, 5500 XT, and the one that we selected, the 1650 Super. I did a bit of research and compared the performance of these cards using gpu.userbenchmark.com along with other benchmarking sources, and found that the 1650 Super offers the absolute best performance for gaming. The specific 1650 Super that we are using is the EVGA GeForce GTX 1650 Super with 4GB of VRAM. Now here's the thing, a lot of people think that 4GB of VRAM will only support 1080p gaming and isn't enough for 1440p or even 4K. That is not true, and I left a link to an article below showing tests done by tweaktown.com explaining why 4GB is absolutely enough for ultra high resolution gaming. Alright, and now for the benchmarks. For this build, we will be talking about the benchmarks for Fortnite, Apex, Rainbow Six Siege, and Warzone. If you want to hear about a different game in my next build, be sure to drop a comment and let me know. Now, if you're playing Fortnite at 1080p at low settings, you're going to get an average of 282 frames per second, so obviously a super competitive frame rate. And if we're looking at high, 86 frames per second, so a good bit above 60 frames per second. So like, for example, if you have a 75 Hz monitor, you absolutely will see those extra frames. Now, if we jump up to 1440p at low settings, you still get above 200 frames per second at 218 in this case, and at epic settings, you get 49 frames per second. So I definitely do not recommend that you run this game at 1440p at epic settings, as you won't even be able to get 60 frames. So if you want to stay within competitive frame rates, I highly recommend you play at 1080p or 1440p at low to medium settings. Now for Apex at 1080p at low settings, you get 208 frames per second. So once again, really high frame rate at low settings. And then at high, you get 77 frames per second. So pretty similar to Fortnite because of how the frame rates are above 75 frames per second in both cases. And you'll absolutely be able to achieve competitive frame rates. Now we head over to 1440p at low, we get 136 frames per second, so really close to 144. I don't really think you'll notice too big of a difference if you were getting 144 and above versus getting 136, but nonetheless, 136 is still a great frame rate to be at if you're playing competitively. And then you head over to high settings and you get 69 frames per second. So it's above 60. If you have a 60 Hz monitor, you won't be able to notice any difference. Keep in mind that if you don't have a refresh rate of above 60 Hz, you won't be able to notice any difference in gameplay if you have a frame rate of above 60 frames per second. Next up, we head over to Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p at low settings. You get 192 frames per second, so it's well above 144. And then we look at Ultra, 110 frames per second. So looking at both settings here, we get above 100 frames per second, which is perfect for competitive gameplay. And then we go to 1440p, at low you get 117, and at high you get 71. So it looks like no matter what setting you're on playing this game, you'll always get an average of above 60 frames per second. Finally, Call of Duty Warzone, definitely the most demanding games of these four that we're talking about. So at 1080p, low average of 109 frames per second, and a high average of 74 frames per second. So 74 frames per second, that's still pretty good to be honest. So if you have a 75 Hz monitor, you'll absolutely be able to see those extra frames. And then if you're playing at low at 109 frames per second, if you have a 144 Hz monitor, you'll get some very smooth gameplay. Now looking at 1440p at low, 82 frames per second, and at high, 53 frames per second. So I definitely do not recommend that you play at a setting higher than medium at 1440p when playing Call of Duty Warzone, simply because you probably won't be able to get an average of 60 frames per second, which is unfortunate, but that's what you get in this price range with the 1650 Super. But at low, you can still get pretty high frame rates. 82 is perfect for competitive gameplay. So, as you can see from these benchmarks, the 1650 Super clearly can achieve competitive frame rates no matter what setting you're at in 1080p and at 1440p. Just with a little bit of tweaking your graphics settings, you'll be able to also get those high frame rates above 60 frames per second. I do not recommend maxing out your settings in more demanding games at 1440p with this card though. So yeah, a solid card that will be able to run all modern titles at high resolutions with ease. Next up, the power supply. What will be powering this PC is the Be Quiet Pure Power 11 500 watt 80 plus gold certified power supply. This is one of the top of the line power supplies, so I do highly recommend this, especially because of its 80 plus gold certification. 80 plus gold certified basically means that this power supply guarantees to provide 87% power efficiency under 100% load, as you can see with this chart. And that means 435 watts in this case. 435 watts is more than enough, as PC Part Picker estimates that this build will take up a max consumption of around 269 watts. This also means that upgrading will be fine, so if you want to get a newer graphics card, CPU head storage, whatever it may be, you definitely can with this great power supply. Finally, the case. I chose the Zalman S3 ATX case. I chose this one for a few reasons. One, it has a very nice minimalistic design with a huge window on the side and the brushed metal look on the front. I also am a fan of Zalman. My old case for my older PC was a Zalman, and it was very sturdy and reliable. But you do not have to use this case if it doesn't match your ideal PC case. You can choose any you'd like as long as it's labeled ATX. You really can't go wrong with the case, so choose whichever ATX case that you'd like. So yeah, that will do it for this build guide. If you build this or plan on building it, let the community know down in the comments. We would love to hear your experience and progress. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Have any comments or questions, drop a comment below, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And if you enjoy the content that you're seeing, drop a sub. Thanks for watching. Peace out.